In an earlier class, I did tell you that Johnson's preface to Shakespeare is actually a product of his times. In other words, Johnson's preface to Shakespeare is a culmination of a long period of his engagement with Shakespeare, which sometimes went as long as 30 years. We are reminded of, and I told you in an earlier class, we are reminded of Johnson's extreme panic when he was reading Macbeth as a teenager, and he rushed into his home when he was visualizing how Macbeth and Banquo would have felt when they saw the witches in Act 1, Scene 2. So that was the intrigue that Shakespeare caused in Johnson for several decades before he finally decided that the reputation of Shakespeare was suffering because there was no fixed text. A lot of texts were circulating in the market. Each of them claimed they were original, but he wanted to make a comparative assessment of all the available texts and finally decide on one text that would define a Shakespeare play. Right? So, the texts that we have with Johnson's editions of Shakespeare are all a result of his engagement with Shakespeare's and multifarious texts that were available at his time. And the work that we are doing now, the work that we are doing, that is the preface to these works, they they act as a platform, in a sense, critical platform, to highlight Samuel Johnson's approach to Shakespeare as well as Samuel Johnson's status as a critic. Right. So now we go into the text. The text that we are to focus on with regard to our exams. Now, when we study preface to his edition of Shakespeare's plays, we are beset with three concerns which are immediately apparent in the preface. What are the three concerns? The three concerns are: first, what causes reputation in a poet? The second is, how is a poet related to nature? And the third is the relative importance of inherent nature and experience of life in a poet. Johnson begins his preface by entering into this debate on the relative virtues of ancient and modern writers. Now, this concern of ancient and modern writers and their comparative importance has been one of extreme critical volatility through most of our critical history, with some people claiming that the ancients are the pole stars which would guide contemporary literary output. So, what we essentially have at the beginning is Johnson's assertion that the excellence of the ancient authors is based on what he says a gradual and a comparative estimate as tested by observation and experience. Now, if we are to judge Shakespeare by these criteria, that is the length of the duration and the continuance of esteem, as he says, we are justified perhaps in allowing Shakespeare to assume the dignity of an ancient, though Shakespeare was less than 200 years old when Johnson was living. And why did Johnson claim that he had a stature of an ancient? Because he felt Shakespeare's reputation has survived the customs, the conflicting opinions, and circumstances of his time. Right? So, this is how the essay begins. Then Johnson develops his idea into exploring the reasons behind Shakespeare's enduring success. Okay, he makes an important general statement, and what is that? He says, nothing can please many and please long, but just representations of general nature. In my earlier talk with you, I explained what Johnson meant by nature as such and general nature in particular. And once again, by general nature, I repeat, Johnson refers to the avoidance of particular manners or passing customs and the foundation of one's work on what he calls as stability of truth. That is, truth that are permanent and universal. And it is in this context that Johnson claims that Shakespeare, above all writers in his time, who is the poet of nature, who who holds up to his readers the faithful mirror of manners and life, and is therefore is therefore a poet who has a just right to permanence and universality. He also goes on to say that Shakespeare's characters are not molded by the accidents of time, place, or local custom. In other words, they are not constricted in their scope, but they are what he says the genuine progeny of common humanity. And this is indeed true because we are studying Shakespeare so many centuries apart, and we are removed from Shakespearean culture by several developments in cultural steps. But still, we find that there is something in Shakespeare which concerns us or which prods us into a particular belief in the status of humanity on earth. So, therefore, Johnson immediately contrasts Shakespeare with other poets. He says other poets present characters as an individual, having idiosyncrasies, having special characteristics which identify that individual as an individual. In contrast, Shakespeare's characters are not individuals, they are species. These are the exact word that he says. The characters are characters who are effectively species. In other words, Johnson is highlighting on the universality of of Shakespeare's characters. And it is by virtue of these facts that he says Shakespeare's plays are filled with practical axioms and domestic wisdom, and from his works, one can, if one is interested, collect a system of civil and humanitarian prudence. These are his exact words. Now, this he says is in contrast to the other hyperbolical or aggravated characters, as he says, of most other playwrights who were writing in the time of Shakespeare. And I gave you references of university wits in an earlier class, and I also suggested as to the extreme desperation of the university wits who were putting in their plays elaborate visual and visually impactful dresses, mannerisms, customs, utilities, so as to attract the audience away from the usual Shakespearean concerns with attracting the audience through dialogue or the common depiction of universal humanity, right? So this is what is the focus of Johnson. Johnson then goes on to defend Shakespeare against some charges brought by critics and writers across time. In other words, it's not that Shakespeare escaped criticism from several critics or writers, and Johnson predominantly identifies three writers who put up Shakespeare's plays for some special focused criticism. Who are the three? Johnson says one is John Dennis, the other is Thomas Rhymer, and the third is Voltaire. These three critics, they argue on a same vein that Shakespeare's characters insufficiently reflect their time period and status. For example, John Dennis says that the Romans in Shakespeare's Roman plays are not sufficiently Roman, or the kings in Shakespeare's plays are not sufficiently royal. In other words, regality does not ooze out, as it were, of their appearance or speech. Contradicting this idea, Johnson says that, and I quote, Shakespeare always makes nature predominate over accident, and he preserves the essential character extricated from accidental conventions and the casual distinction of country and condition. So, how is Johnson defending Shakespeare? Johnson's main basis is that Shakespeare's characters should not be expected to reflect certain narrow, specific local conditions or characteristics. They are all characters which are universal. And it is to this extent that Shakespeare's claim of universality cannot be found to be constrictive, as claimed or as criticized by John Dennis, Thomas Rhymer, and Voltaire. For example, he specifies Shakespeare's prolific use of tragicomedies. In other words, plays which have elaborate and deep nuances of tragedy, as well as plays which end happily while having these deep nuances of tragedy. The tragicomedies, for example, Johnson says that these tragicomedies are ample evidences of Shakespeare's concern with nature as the primary mode or platform of his poetic expression, and not blind adherence to certain rules. Because obviously, if the rules of the ancients, as has been handed down for generations in Shakespeare's time, are to be believed, it is very clear that a comedy is a comedy and a tragedy is a comedy. A tragedy is a tragedy, and there is no way in which the strains of these two can meet. But Shakespeare departs from that because he actually understands that in human lives, nothing is inherently and continuously tragic, and nothing is inherently and continuously comic. But most of us live through these continuing waves of tragedies and comedies. And hence, Johnson says Shakespeare was an expert in writing tragic comedies. Right? However, Johnson's defense of Shakespeare is not blind. In fact, Johnson does concede at several places that Shakespeare had many faults. According to Johnson, Shakespeare's first fault is that and these are the exact words that he says, Shakespeare is more careful to please than to instruct, that he seems to write without any moral purpose. So this is the first charge, as it were, that Johnson places on Shakespeare, that he is writing without any overt moral aim before him. Right? Johnson acknowledges that from many Shakespeare's plays, we can extricate nuances of social duty. But the problem with such extrication invariably is that Shakespeare's precepts and axioms or maxims drop very casually from him. He does not attain the stature of a pulpit speaker or preacher, and therefore the good and the bad appear to operate by chance, randomly. And therefore, he says, it would have been better if Shakespeare had a much more firmer moral purpose in his plays. There is another defect which Johnson identifies that Shakespeare can be charged with, but he at the same time places or defends Shakespeare from the charge. And the defect is, and in fact, this is not Samuel Johnson alone who charged Shakespeare with this defect. Several other critics before Johnson charged Shakespeare with the defect of deliberately flouting the ancient dramatic notions of unities of time, place, and action, which are commonly known as the classical unities of drama. Johnson, in this context, takes opportunity to elaborate on the ancient rules, and he says that judging Shakespeare's plays, It would not be fair if we are to judge Shakespeare's worth by his adherence to the ancient or the classical rule of the three unities. For example, he exempts Shakespeare's histories from any requirement of unity because he says that these are neither tragedies nor comedies and therefore they are not subject to the laws which govern either tragedy or comedy. In other words, he says what is required in these history plays is that the changes of action be so prepared as to be understood, that the incidents be various and affecting, and the characters consistent, natural, and distinct. No other unity is intended. Unquote. These are his exact words. So, if you are to judge Shakespeare's history plays, Johnson says we have to understand these plays as a sum total of several incidents involving characters who are consistent, who are natural in their actions and speech, and who are distinct from one another. Right? So, and for with regard to the unities of time and place, Johnson says that Shakespeare had no regard, but nevertheless, Johnson defends Shakespeare by questioning the three unities themselves, because views these three unities as something which gives more trouble to the poet, and therefore, more trouble to the poet are Johnson's exact words. And Johnson says that these unities essentially arose once upon a time to make the drama more credible, and therefore the unities may have outlived their importance. Because quite obviously, the three unities are the unities which were products of ancient Greek and Roman drama. Clearly, in Shakespeare's time, Johnson asserts it's not fair or wise to expect the rules of an ancient dramatic regime on. It won't be fair if that is used to judge the proficiency or otherwise of an Elizabethan playwright. So therefore, for Johnson, Shakespeare's violation of the three unities are not effective violations because Shakespeare outgrew the constrictive nature of the three unities. Right? So this is a very very important area it's an important area of focus in Shakespeare Johnson's preface to Shakespeare. What are the characteristics which are identified by Johnson as Shakespearean weak points, as it were, and how does in some cases Johnson exonerate Shakespeare from the charge of flouting the classical rules or the unities of time, place, and action. But Johnson says that Shakespeare's flouting of these rules, they are not deliberate or they are not something which are casual. He just finds that his stature as a poet, has outgrown the constrictive nature of the three unities, because according to Johnson, Shakespeare imitates nature and nature alone very well. Right? So what he says, Johnson says Shakespeare's plays give us pleasure not because they are mistaken for realities, but because they bring what he says realities to the mind. In other words, when we read a play of Shakespeare, we are removed from the nuances of the character's time. For example, if you read Julius Caesar, we are definitely not living in an age where the Romans in any form rule over us, later on Julius Caesar. But nevertheless, as a reader or as a person who is seeing Julius Caesar acted on the stage, we are very often moved by the extreme overconfidence of Julius Caesar, the historical character, Whether that overconfidence actually contributed to his murder and downfall is a different issue. But the speeches of Julius Caesar cannot fail to stir us into some form of a heightened perception of our own worth as individuals. And to that extent, clearly Shakespeare, according to Johnson, was quite within his stature, quite within his stature as a creative poet and a dramatist, to do what? To outgrow the historical constrictions of Julius Caesar, the character, and convert that historical character into something with whom we can easily relate when we are either reading the plays or when we are seeing Julius Caesar acted before us. So this essentially is what Johnson feels is the reason why Shakespeare's plays still have a preeminent following. But nevertheless, Johnson broadly agrees with the tradition that Shakespeare might have lacked a formal training. At least he did not have the formal training which many of his contemporary playwrights, including the university wits, went through. And the greater part of Shakespeare's excellence was, according to Johnson, a product of his own genius. Right? And perhaps Johnson hints that since Shakespeare was depending on his genius alone to craft his plays, his plays are effectively closer to nature than the plays of the university wits, who effectively had one eye back on the following of the ancient rules and customs. So clearly, according to Johnson, the university wits could not transfer their creative genius into their works, largely because their creativity was constricted by their eye on the following of ancient dramatic rules. Another area in which Johnson exerted significant influence on his successors was the area of biography, as it were, and comparative estimation of the poets in the English canon. In this context, Johnson very clearly says that Shakespeare was much ahead of his times, largely because Shakespeare's ethos was largely based on creativity, a creativity that was true to his own perception of the life around him, and a creativity that did not consider specific or constrictive rules in order to devise a platform for output. So therefore, what we are getting here, we are essentially getting a poet or a playwright who is proficiently creating characters and stamping each of these characters with certain s- very special traits, which are at the same time universal and which are at the same time special to that specific character alone. And judged in this context, Johnson, for example, has a very high estimate of Shakespeare's Macbeth. Specifically, the Macbeth that the play that yielded a character of as much complexity as Lady Macbeth. Now, if we read Macbeth judging only the development of Lady Macbeth as a character, we would definitely be perplexed as to how accurately Shakespeare could bring up a character with so many inherent complexities. And perhaps Johnson highlights that these complexities are the reasons why Shakespearean characters are close to us, because we can easily identify characters with complexities who have shades of gray rather than characters who are either overtly white or overtly dark. Notice, for example, and when we are reading Johnson's approach to Shakespeare, we can also develop our own ideas as to what Johnson may have thought with regard to a particular Shakespeare play. For example, when we are reading Macbeth with an eye on Lady Macbeth, we cannot miss the extreme ambition that colors the character of Lady Macbeth right from the first time we meet her. But nevertheless, at the same time, we find Lady Macbeth at her most helpless when her ambition counters with her essential humanity or essential womanhood, as Shakespeare might have thought of it. And that is highlighted best, for example, in that scene where Lady Macbeth, perhaps disgusted or fed up with Macbeth's quote unquote cowardice, herself takes the murder weapon, goes into the chamber of Duncan with the ostensible purpose of killing him, but nevertheless failing to kill him, coming out and telling those immortal lines: "Had he not resembled my father when he slept, I would have done the deed." So clearly, we find in these lines an enormous conflict that is going on in the mind of Lady Macbeth. And in fact, most of our lives are also lives which are laced with conflicts. And the decisions that we make either way are decisions that are made after a careful evaluation of the conflicts themselves. Such a nuanced character as Lady Macbeth is clearly missing in the plays of the other university fates. We don't find them. In fact, the closest nuanced character who appears very close to a Shakespearean to Shakespearean genius is perhaps Dr. Faustus of Christopher Marlowe. And that is the reason why Dr. Faustus is again a very popular text, because we find several things which are definitely universal in how Marlowe portrays Dr. Faustus in the play. So clearly, Johnson's focus in the preface is threefold. First, an assessment of Shakespeare as a playwright. Second, some form of a comparison between Shakespeare and the other ancients, with a special eye on how Shakespeare's genius, found the ancient rules or customs constrictive and simply outgrew them by dint of an enormous creative and genius, creative and intense poetic output. And the third important issue that Johnson highlights here is Shakespeare may have had faults, but most of his faults can also be approached as faults which are an outcome of his engagement with plots, themes, or stories which are much removed from his time. For example, Johnson places a great deal of importance on how Shakespeare converted these historical stories of Plutarch into historical plays that we know it, be it Julius Caesar, be it Antony and Cleopatra, be it a number of other history plays based on English histories. They are all plays which are removed in time, whose contents are removed in time from Shakespeare's own, and perhaps in a totally different culture from Shakespeare. And we must understand that unlike today's times, or even unlike Johnson's time, Shakespeare's time did not give, the Shakespearean age did not give people who are writing like Shakespeare that liberty to go at length and research elaborately on Roman history, for example. Print editions of books were very rare and very expensive. So, judged in that context, Johnson clearly implies that Shakespeare made much of the historical incidents that he found to be appropriate enough to be put into a play. The historical incidents portrayed, for example, in Plutarch's lives, or for example, the historical incidents that Shakespeare heard himself as he grew up and interacted, possibly the rule of Henrys, the rule of Richards, etc., who were 200 to 300 years removed from him. So clearly, for Johnson, Shakespeare was a genius whose poetic output or whose dramatic output cannot be judged within the constrictive locales or frameworks of ancient Greek or Roman dramatic rules, the three unities specifically. On the other hand, Shakespeare's the reason why Shakespeare stays on till his time, and in fact till our time, is because Johnson felt Shakespeare was true to nature. In other words, Shakespeare was universal. And most of the Shakespearean characters, as I've already highlighted, they are all characters which are portrayed with that exact frame of mind and reference as might have been expected of a character put into that particular context in a life, a real life situation. And that is the reason why we find much in Shakespearean plays which we feel are actually so very true and accurate, and many feel that maybe they would have done pretty much the same thing when they were put into that role of a Shakespearean character, right? So it is in these contexts that Johnson approaches Shakespeare. But nevertheless, remember, Johnson's approach to Shakespeare is one major work which reflects as if the approach of the entire uh, age of Johnson on Shakespeare, and that is the reason why we study it today. There were other approaches to Shakespeare in the subsequent years. For example, the Romantics approached Shakespeare in pretty much the same way. If we read, for example, John Keats's assertions of or reading of Shakespeare's plays, or Coleridge's elaborate rendering of how he thought Shakespeare was a genius of his time, they are all evidence of some form of a continuation of the critical strain that was introduced into critical theory by Samuel Johnson. And somehow or the other, even if we read of how Dickens approached Shakespeare or how Matthew Arnold approached Shakespeare, we would be seeing that there was something which was very similar in nuance between how Johnson approached Shakespeare a couple of centuries back and how, let's say, Matthew Arnold approached Shakespeare in Victorian times. So clearly, the primacy of Johnson's preface to Shakespeare is one, the work is a reflection of the age of Johnson on Shakespeare. The second, Johnson's preeminence as a critic is highlighted and put into great focus because subsequent approaches to Shakespeare are all colored and influenced heavily by how Johnson read and interpreted Shakespeare's plays. And this is the reason why there's an element of universality in the methodology that Johnson adopts to evaluate Shakespeare as a playwright.